The small-town mystery that left police baffled. The woods were dark, quiet, and heavy with summer heat when the searchers found them. At first, it didn't look real. It was just a ditch filled with muddy water, branches, and torn brush. But as the flashlights cut through the shadows, shapes started to appear. Shapes that didn't belong there. Bodies. Small ones. The bodies of 3 children. Their names would echo across the nation. Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers. The searchers froze, their voices caught in their throats. No one expected to find the boys like this. They had only been missing a few hours, gone after an ordinary afternoon of riding bikes and playing together in the neighborhood. But now, there they were, stripped, bound, and lifeless in the water of Robin Hood Hills, a patch of woods on the edge of West Memphis, Arkansas. The air felt different after that. What should have been the sound of crickets and frogs was replaced by whispers of fear, by people stumbling backward, covering their mouths, not wanting to believe what they saw. Some officers rushed to pull the boys from the ditch. Others stood silent, their faces pale under the glow of their flashlights. They were stunned, not only by the horror of the scene, but by how cruel and senseless it seemed. Who could do this to children? By the time the sun came up, word had spread. Neighbors gathered near the police tape. Parents clutched their own kids close, and reporters arrived with cameras that captured the grim expressions of law enforcement. For a small town like West Memphis, this crime was not just shocking. It was almost impossible to understand. In places like New York or Los Angeles, people expected stories of violence. But here, in a town where people knew their neighbors, where kids rode bikes until dinner, and where families gathered at church on Sundays, no one was prepared for this. That morning, investigators were already talking about possibilities. They noticed how the boys were tied, how brutal the injuries looked. Rumors started almost instantly, rumors of something bigger than just a murder. Whispers of satanic rituals spread to the crowd like sparks. Some swore they saw strange markings on the boys' bodies. Others believed the woods themselves were cursed. By noon, the story had turned from a tragedy into a mystery, and the police were desperate for answers. But before the crime scene could be fully processed, the town itself became part of the case. Parents demanded justice. Reporters swarmed. Churches filled with frightened families asking how such evil could come to their quiet community. The pressure on investigators grew heavier by the hour. The police began their search for suspects. They looked at known troublemakers, loners, and anyone who seemed different. And soon, their eyes landed on 3 teenagers, Damien Echols, Jason Baldwin, and Jessie Misskelley. They weren't like other kids. Damien dressed in black, listened to heavy metal, and read strange books. Jason was quieter, but often by Damien's side. Jessie was younger, a boy with learning difficulties who was easily influenced. In a town looking for someone to blame, they stood out like targets. Before long, investigators brought Jessie in for questioning. What happened next would shape the entire case. Jessie sat for hours as police pressed him for answers. At first, he denied knowing anything. But after long hours with confusing questions and pressure he couldn't handle, Jessie's story began to change. He started repeating details police suggested, weaving them into a confession that didn't match the crime scene in many ways, but sounded convincing enough to people desperate for closure. When news broke that Jessie Misskelley had confessed, the town let out a sigh of relief. Finally, they thought the monsters were caught. Damien and Jason were quickly arrested too, their names and faces splashed across newspapers and TV screens. The West Memphis Three, as they would come to be known, were painted as satanic killers, teenagers who murdered 3 boys as part of a ritual. But behind the headlines, cracks in the case were already showing. Jessie's confession was filled with mistakes, wrong times, wrong details, contradictions. No physical evidence tied the teens to the crime scene. And yet, the story of satanic worship was too sensational to ignore. The prosecution leaned into it, playing on the town's fears, painting Damien especially as a dangerous, devil-worshipping leader. While the circus played out, the families of the murdered boys were left to grieve in a spotlight they never asked for. Stevie Branch's mother broke down on camera, begging for justice. Michael Moore's father shook with rage at court hearings. Christopher Byers' stepfather pounded his fists, demanding the death penalty. For them, it wasn't about doubts or evidence. It was about their children, gone in the most horrific way imaginable. As weeks turned into months, the trial grew into a spectacle. Reporters filled the courtroom. Sketch artists captured Damien's blank stare, and whispers about the occult echoed through the town. Every day, it seemed the case was less about what really happened in Robin Hood Hills, and more about what people wanted to believe. But deep down, a question lingered. What if the real killer was still out there? And late one night, as investigators combed through piles of evidence, one officer stumbled across something odd, something small, but sharp enough to raise doubts about everything they thought they knew. The room grew still. Had they been chasing the wrong people all along? The detective sat hunched over files, the faint hum of the police station's air conditioner the only sound breaking the silence. His eyes had been scanning pages for hours, crime scene reports, interviews, timelines, when something caught his attention. It wasn't a bloody knife or a footprint photo. It was a detail, small but strange, buried in the paperwork. The time of death didn't match the confession. Jessie Misskelley, in his taped statement, had said the murders happened in the morning, but every pathologist's report pointed clearly to the evening. How could Jessie have been so wrong if he was actually there? The contradiction was glaring. Either Jessie was lying, or worse, he was telling police what he thought they wanted to hear. The detective rubbed his temples. If Jessie's confession was shaky, then what about Damien and Jason? There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no weapon that tied them to the crime. Just fear, rumor, and a story that seemed to grow stranger the more it was told. Meanwhile, in the small town of West Memphis, fear still choked the air. Parents refused to let their kids ride bikes after dark. Churches preached about evil, warning of satanic cults lurking in plain sight. Supermarkets buzzed with whispers. Did you hear about the devil worshippers? They say those boys sacrificed them. It didn't matter that the evidence was thin. Fear had already built its own truth. But not everyone agreed. A few townspeople started to wonder if the wrong boys were behind bars. A teacher said Damien wasn't violent, just misunderstood. A neighbor insisted Jason was polite, quiet, and kept to himself. Jessie's family swore he couldn't have masterminded a crime that brutal. He could barely keep his schoolwork straight. These voices were drowned out by louder ones calling for blood. The trials moved forward. Prosecutors leaned heavily on Jessie's confession, even though it shifted every time he retold it. They showed the jury drawings of pentagrams, heavy metal lyrics, and books Damien had read. To them, these were proof of evil. But to others, it was just evidence of a teenager fascinated by rebellion and dark music. Nothing more. Still, in a town terrified by the idea of satanic rituals, it was enough. The jury watched as Jessie stumbled through testimony, contradicting himself under cross-examination. They watched as prosecutors painted Damien as a cult leader and Jason as his loyal follower. Parents of the murdered boys sat in the front rows, their grief burning holes through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously, their stories feeding a national frenzy about the satanic panic sweeping through America. When the verdict came, the room went silent. Jessie Misskelley was sentenced to life plus 40 years. Jason Baldwin, only 16 years old, received life without parole. And Damien Echols, painted as a ringleader, was given the ultimate punishment, death. The families of the murdered boys wept, believing justice had finally been served. The town sighed with relief. For many, the story was over. The monsters were locked away. But it wasn't over, not by a long shot. Years passed, and the case began to attract new attention. Documentaries were made, lawyers questioned the evidence, and investigators outside of Arkansas started to dig deeper. What they found was troubling. DNA collected from the crime scene, hair strands, fibers, blood, did not match Damien, Jason, or Jessie. Instead, one hair found in the bindings matched a member of one of the victims' families. It wasn't conclusive, but it was enough to raise serious doubts. Supporters for the West Memphis Three grew louder. Celebrities like Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam and actor Johnny Depp joined the fight, raising money for appeals. They argued that the case was built on fear, not facts. They pointed out the shaky confession, the lack of evidence, the way prosecutors had relied on satanic panic rather than science. But while these debates raged, 3 men sat in prison. Damien lived on death row, locked in solitary confinement, reading and writing to keep his mind alive. Jason spent his youth behind bars, watching his life shrink to a cell. Jessie, struggling with his learning difficulties, barely understood the full weight of his sentence. Then, in 2007, everything changed. New DNA testing became available, far more advanced than what had existed in 1993. Samples from the crime scene were tested again, and once more, none of them matched Damien, Jason, or Jessie. The evidence was crumbling. The question everyone feared was being asked again. Had the wrong people been behind bars for nearly 2 decades? In West Memphis, people argued in grocery stores and at church pews. Some believed the 3 were innocent, victims of a broken system. Others clung to the belief that they were guilty, because if they weren't, that meant the real killer had never been caught. That idea was too terrifying for many to accept. The pressure on the state mounted. After years of appeals in 2011, the 3 men were offered something called an Alford plea, a strange legal deal that allowed them to walk free while still technically pleading guilty. It was a compromise. They could go home. But the state didn't have to admit it made a mistake. On the day of their release, crowds gathered outside the courthouse. Jason, Jessie, and Damien walked out together, older, thinner, but free for the first time in 18 years. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and supporters cheered. Damien, who had been closest to execution, shielded his eyes from the sun, as if he couldn't believe the outside world was real again. But freedom did not mean peace. They were still branded as killers in the eyes of many. Their names were tied forever to the Robin Hood Hills murders. And worst of all, the case remained unsolved. If the West Memphis Three didn't commit the crime, then who did? That question still haunts the town today. And then, just when people thought the case had grown cold, a rumor spread. Someone new was talking. Someone connected to one of the families. The police were about to hear something that would once again shake the small town of West Memphis. The mystery wasn't over. It was just taking a darker turn.